Hello everyone, Dr. West here. This is part 1 of chapter 14, and we are going to be starting our discussion of learning and memory, and we're going to talk a little bit about what it means to say that your brain is plastic. This will be a continuation of some of the stuff that we talked about before, sort of this overall idea of cognitive psychology, sort of that intersection between your thinking processes, learning, memory, problem solving. But again, being that this is brain and behavior, we're going to be talking about what's actually happening in the brain. What's the biological side of what's going on when some of those memory processes are happening. So we're going to start off here, and we're going to talk a little bit here about how we learn and how we remember. We're going to review some stuff. Hopefully some of this you'll have heard or remember from intro psych, but if not, we'll go over it a little bit again. But we're going to start off today by kind of thinking about, what does it mean to learn? What does it mean to remember something? What does that even look like? So the first thing I want you to remember is that your brain is what we call plastic. And I don't mean it's made of plastic, right? What I mean by that, this is a term that we use in psychology that basically just means that your brain is changeable, moldable, and it all comes down to experience. The more experience that you give your brain, the more your brain will change along with that experience. This is also where we get that phrase from that we say a lot, particularly as people age, that use it or lose it kind of phenomenon. If you want your brain to continuously be active and continuously be able to do things and remember things, you need to be continuously doing things and trying to remember things. So all of the things that you experience throughout your life are going to change your brain. As you develop, your brain will change. As you experience things within your culture, things will change. As you experience other cultures, your brain will change. As you develop preferences for things, as you allow yourself to try new experiences and possibly develop new experiences and new preferences, as you cope with trauma, as you cope with stress, all of that changes your brain. And so we have a very formal term here called neuroplasticity, and this is just the fancy way of saying your nervous system has potential for physical and chemical change that enhances its ability to be adaptive to whatever situation that you're in. And so basically, what does it say? What does it mean to be adaptive? Well, it just means that you're here to learn. Your brain is able to learn, and you are able to learn what works best in a given environment, what works best for a given situation. Sometimes you're learning things on purpose because you have an end goal. In this case, you're doing very formalized learning because your end goal is to get a degree that required you to learn something to then take a test to show that you've mastered said learning, to then get said degree, to then get hopefully a job that you're looking for. But sometimes it's not even that formalized. Sometimes we're still learning all the time. We're still learning things in order to meet some sort of goal. And throughout that process, our brain changes to allow that growth to happen. And again, that growth happens in the form of learning. So that's how we sort of get our definition of learning. It's a change in an organism's behavior just as a result of experience. And I'm going to come back to that in a bit because I'm going to talk to you some about some kinds of learning. And then we're also going to talk a bit about memory too. And memory is just the ability to recall or recognize previous experiences. And what actually happens in the brain is you get something called a memory trace, or basically a representation of a previous experience in your brain that sort of corresponds to some experience you've had, which means that there was some sort of learning that occurred, and you get physical changes in the brain that represent that learning experience, and that is what we call, as far as biology goes, a memory in your brain. It's a pretty neat phenomenon, and it's definitely something that we're still working on trying to understand as we move forward, and as this kind of field of a mix of kind of biology and psychology come together. This field of neuroscience in general is is growing, this is one of the big areas that's really growing and learning, especially also as it sort of interfaces with things like artificial intelligence and whatnot. So if any of this interests you, this is a huge growing field within this particular part of psychology. What I'm actually going to do now for just a minute is hop over to another lecture that I pre-recorded. It's got some older stuff in it, but it's going to go over some of the same material. So I am going to cover this information from your book on classical conditioning, as well as this information from operant conditioning. But I'm going to do it using some older slides, also just because there were some older examples that were really funny. So I will come back in just a minute after having reviewed these two terms with you. So I'll see you in just a bit.
Okay, watch what happens here. Oh, he ducks. All right, that's the first video.
Every week, Casper puts on his superhero cape and drives to a research center to meet Rob Harris for his training. Some scientists believe dogs with noses as sensitive as Casper's may actually be able to sniff out cancer in people. They don't quite know yet what that exact smell is, but if they can isolate it, they could build a cancer-detecting machine that could help save thousands of lives. Casper's lab assistant training is at the forefront of this research. Today will determine whether he has passed the first stage of his training. While Casper waits, Rob sets up the test.
Each of these arms that we've got here, there's 8 points for the Casper to sniff into, and on one of them points is an odour for Casper to detect, and that's what he's being trained to find at the moment. He has no idea that where we've put this sample, so hopefully when he comes in, he'll sniff around, find it, and give his indication.
Can he prove he's got what it takes to be a superhero doggy doctor? Remember, Casper has to sniff out the right plate to pass. Casper's made his choice, but did he get it right? Let's take a look at the instant replay. So, was Casper right? Yes! Spot on!
And look what happens here.
What you've seen Casper do is identify that unique odour and give us that C indication, and that's exactly the behaviour that I'm looking for to know that he's ready to move on to detecting cancer samples. Casper's a fan.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and stop it there. Again, I've also given you these links here in the PowerPoint if you'd like to go ahead and rewatch or watch the full videos, especially if the sound wasn't great quality for you. But let's talk about what was happening there. So in the first video where the sister was shooting her brother every time she was playing that quack sound, what did you notice? Well, hopefully what you noticed is at first it was just irritating him. But that by that last time when I was telling you to pay attention, all she had to do was hit the quack sound and he ducked and he covered his head. He was expecting that she was getting ready to shoot him. So obviously he had learned that whenever my sister plays that annoying quack sound, she's about to hit me with the dart gun. All right, keep that in mind. That's one of the kinds of things we're going to talk about. Then in the second video, what you saw is that this trainer is working with the dog. Ultimately, he wants him to be able to sniff out and to tell to the scientist when he smells a particular sample and ultimately be able to smell out cancer. But every time the dog did something good, I don't know if you saw it right there at the end, when the dog identified the correct sample, the trainer gave him a treat. Right? That's going to reinforce that behavior. That's going to make the dog want to do it more because dogs like treats. And that's the second type of learning that we're going to talk about here today. So keep these two examples in mind as we start to go through some of our material here. The first thing that we're going to talk about just in general is what is learning? What does that even mean? Well, in psychology, we define it as acquiring new information or new behaviors through some sort of experience. So something happens to you and you're able to learn new information or a new set of behaviors. So you learn how to play a new sport, or you learn how to write something a certain way. You learn a new date. You learn a new name. You learn a new term in psychology. All of those things that you're getting more information, you're getting new behaviors that you know how to do because of some experience you had learning that thing. And then there's 3 ways that this really works well, right? So we learn through association. This was the first video that I kind of showed you. We learn that we can associate or put together that certain things go together. You're going to ultimately hear this is called classical conditioning. What we have also known is that stimuli that are not controlled or associated, and this is that bad sentence, and I meant to correct it in the other class and I totally forgot. Okay, what I'm trying to say here essentially is that there are some stimuli that you can't necessarily control, and there's other times where your response is automatic. So the example I'm going to give you on the next slide is lightning and thunder. And sometimes people can't respond on purpose. You know, they get startled by the thunder, right? Particularly small children. I was one of those. That's automatic. I can't control that response. But I'm going to learn that certain things go together. So we're going to talk about how you can associate certain things. The little brother associated that sound of the quack with being shot by the Nerf gun. The second way that we can learn is through consequences. The consequences of our behaviors and our actions, all right, are going to either help us say, hey, that was a great idea, or that was not a great idea. And we will either do something more or do something less. This is called operant conditioning. And that's what was going on in the case of our cancer sniffing dog. Every time he did something good, he was getting a treat. And the dog would learn, hey, that's a good thing to do because I like getting treats. I'm going to do that behavior more. And then the last thing, the last kind of way that you can learn is through acquisition of mental information that guides your behavior. In other words, cognitive learning. This is hopefully what you're doing right now. I'm teaching you these terms, and hopefully you're going to go and do some sort of cognitive learning, either repeating them over and over again, making flashcards for yourself, quizzing yourself, whatever works for you to try to commit these ideas and these terms to memory. And we do all 3 of these a lot. So a little bit more about associative learning. What you're doing with associative learning is you're learning that 2 things tend to go together. So let's go back to that example I was telling you. When I was a little kid, I hated lightning. Probably because what I really hated was the thunder. The thunder scared me. All right, that loud booming noise, sometimes it would even shake the house, was very, very scary as a child. I didn't have to learn that. That was an automatic response. That's what I was trying to tell you in that previous slide. All right. What I did learn, though, is that every time I saw lightning, very likely what was about to happen is it was about to be thunder. So what I learned to pair together is that lightning usually equals thunder. So that sometimes when I would even just see the lightning, so think, for example, in the summer with that stuff we call heat lightning, where it's not actually thundering, it's just lightning, I might still feel very, very nervous. And I used to as a child. I hated it when I saw lightning. Sometimes I would even hate it when I saw other things like blinking lights that might have been lightning. Because again, I had learned that lightning probably means there's thunder, and thunder is scary. Does that make sense? I made a connection or an association, that's why we call this associative learning, between 2 different events that went together. That being said, let's talk about what Pavlov was up to. He was not a psychologist by training. Again, he was one of those first people that didn't even realize that's what he was doing. He was actually studying the digestive system. He even won a Nobel Prize, which is exceedingly impressive. But what he was looking at what he was collecting in his lab was actually the saliva from dogs. So he would present them with food treats so that they would actually start to salivate. And then he was looking at some of the digestive enzymes and things that were in the salivation. But what he kind of learned almost by accident, right, which turned out to be exceedingly important for psychology, is that when he would show these animals the food, they would slobber. He would show them the food and they would slobber. And what he actually learned is that after a while, all right, he wouldn't even have to show the food anymore. And here's what was going on that actually got that to happen. So what he was doing is he would show them the food. And prior to this, right, if he had played some kind of tone or some kind of bell, these dogs would have looked at him maybe with that sideways dog head thing like, what you doing, right? But it wouldn't have meant anything. But what he would do, right, or what was kind of accidentally happening at first and then he was doing it on purpose, is the sound of the tone would go off, then he would show the dog the food. The food is automatically going to make the dog slobber. The dog does not have to learn that, right? So the food is what we call an unconditioned stimulus. So when you see some of these words here, you can take the word conditioned and you can actually put in the word learned. You can kind of substitute the two words. Now, I'm going to use the word conditioned because that's the formal word. But again, when you're trying to remember what it's talking about, just remember unlearned. So food is unlearned. The dog does not have to learn that food is yummy, right? So food will always make the dog slobber, right? So if I show the dog this unconditioned stimulus of food, the dog is going to slobber. If I show him the tone, the dog's going to look at you like that doesn't mean anything because this tone, right, is neutral. Does that make sense? Okay. But again, what Pavlov was doing was he was ringing the tone first, then showing the food. And again, the food is automatically going to make the dog salivate, right? Because again, food is an unconditioned stimulus. Salivating is an unconditioned response, meaning the dog does not have to learn to slobber when there's food around. But what do you think happened over time? Well, just like with me and the lightning and thunder, the dog learned, hey, every time I hear that bell or that sound, that means that guy's about to give me some food. So after a while, that neutral tone became a conditioned or a learned stimulus. The dog learned that that tone means food is coming. So the dog would start slobbering or start salivating, anticipating that the food was coming. Does that make sense? All right, let me give you a few definitions here. Classical conditioning, again, is just a type of learning, one of the types of association learning where you're linking up two or more stimuli to anticipate events. In other words, the dog learned that bell means food is coming. So I anticipate that if I hear the bell, food is coming and I'm going to start to salivate. The little brother, all right, learned that the duck quack sound meant my sister's about to shoot me with a Nerf gun. So the brother learned to anticipate that. So in that very last trial, he didn't even actually get shot, but he was expecting to, so he ducked and he covered his head. At the beginning of an experiment, you would have some stimulus that is considered neutral. In other words, it's not going to elicit a response. At the beginning, the brother would not necessarily have responded, right, to the quacking sound. The dog is not going to respond to the bell. But you also have an unconditioned or an unlearned response. So again, what this would be in this case is there's some kind of response that you're going to have that you don't have to learn. It's just going to automatically happen. In this case, when you show the dog the food, the unconditioned stimulus, the dog does not have to learn that's yummy to slobber. So that's the unconditioned response is the salivating to the unconditioned stimulus or the unlearned stimulus of the food. But what can actually happen is that eventually, right, that the neutral stimulus can become a conditioned stimulus. In other words, the dog can pair the unconditioned stimulus, the food, with the sound of the tone to where eventually the tone will become something that means something to the dog. All right, that process is called acquisition. Acquisition is the initial learning stage of classical conditioning where you're just learning to pair up or to associate the neutral stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus. So this was all the different trials that you saw the sister going through. Trial 1, trial 3, trial 5, whatever it was, where she would play the quack, shoot him, play the quack, shoot him. And she did it all over the place, right? All over the house. He was watching TV at one point. He was brushing his teeth at one point. This is acquisition. Again, the important part here is that what's happening is you are learning to pair the two different stimuli together. You are pairing up, right, the one neutral stimulus with the unconditioned stimulus, the one that's always going to produce a response. All right, in most cases, two important points here. If the conditioning is going to occur, the neutral stimulus needs to happen first. So in other words, the sister needed to play the quack, then shoot the dart gun. Play the quack, then shoot the dart gun. Right? Let's talk about the dog, for example, because that might make a little bit more sense. The dog has to hear the bell, then see the food. Hear the bell, then see the food. This makes a lot of sense because if you just show the food or go ahead and give the food, the dog's not going to pay attention to anything else because it's going to be wanting the food. So it's probably not even going to pay attention to the bell and definitely not make the connection that bell means food is coming. Does that make sense? So for this to work, the neutral stimulus has to come first, right before the unconditioned stimulus. So bell right before food. It's also important that the time, right, should be really short, about half a second. You don't want to put too much time in between when you do the neutral stimulus and when you have the unconditioned stimulus. I don't want to play the bell, wait a minute, then give the food, because the dog's going to forget that the bell even happened. I don't want to do the quack sound, wait a long time, then shoot my brother, because the brother's not going to make that association, or at least won't make it as well or as quickly. So in other words, to get acquisition to occur the fastest and the best, neutral stimulus first, right before the unconditioned, and you don't want to put a lot of time in between two, about a half a second. So basically present one, present the other. Present one, present the other. I'm going to give you another example of this only because this is from an older textbook and the example is ridiculous, but it made me laugh. So I figured maybe this will help you remember because I remembered it just because of how ridiculous it was. Also a little appropriate that we're doing this right before Valentine's Day. So we'll think of it this way. All right, so another example of acquisition. Again, I was telling you it needs to happen about half a second before it occurs. So here's something that we know will happen. An unconditioned stimulus is an example of this is a passionate kiss. If you get a passionate kiss from someone, it will lead to sexual arousal. That is an unconditioned or unlearned response. You do not have to learn that this is going to happen. Your body will just respond. Does that make sense? So unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response. This is where the example got ridiculous. They gave the example in the book that if your partner happens to have onion breath, right? They said that eventually what you would learn is that you would smell the onion breath right before you got that passionate kiss, right? That would lead to the arousal. So in this case, the passionate kiss is still leading to arousal. But because you're smelling that onion breath each time right before you get the kiss, you're going to quickly learn to pair up, all right, the onion breath with the passionate kiss. So that eventually, onion breath alone, just smelling onion breath, can lead to sexual arousal. Again, ridiculousness. Why onion breath and not, toothpaste breath or something a little less gross? But I guess it makes their point, right? Is that again, it has to happen right before, and because it's happening before, whether you like it or not, you will start to pair those two together such that eventually onion breath alone can lead to sexual arousal. Now I hope your Valentine's Day is onion breath free, but if not, at least you'll know acquisition might be occurring.
In this next video, we're going to talk about the second type of association learning, but this time what you are associating isn't two cues anymore. What you're associating is a behavior with the consequence that follows that behavior. And if the consequence is desirable, you'll very likely do the behavior again. And if the consequence is not desirable, you'll very likely not do the behavior again. So Thorndike was really interested in studying this, and he found that he could get animals to perform very complex behaviors. He could have them, this is for example considered a puzzle box. He would put them into these puzzle boxes and have them do very complex behaviors in order to earn treats and to get treats. So they could have to learn very complex things like pushing a lever and doing certain things to get the cage to open, to get the treats. He would have all sorts of animals doing mazes and things. And what he basically found was they were able to do these things and were more motivated to solve the puzzles or to get out of the maze when there was some sort of reward at the end.
And this sort of led to this line of thinking, again, a second type of association learning, that animals, organisms, you and me, learn to associate various behaviors with consequences. So for example, the seal in the picture has learned, hey, when I balance this ball on my nose, my trainer gives me a very yummy fish treat. And they love fish treats. And because I like that fish treat and I'm a seal, I'm going to do the behavior again. I'm going to balance the ball some more, hoping that the trainer will give me even more treats. So this is the idea here. You're pairing the behavior that you did with what occurred afterwards. So what occurred was I got a yummy fish treat. So that means I'm more likely to do the behavior again. And this leads us to this idea of operant conditioning. Operant conditioning functions basically on the level of the environment. In other words, the environment produces the consequence, whether it's some sort of rewarding stimuli or some sort of punishing stimuli. If you like the reward, all right, you're going to associate it back with that action. Hey, when I did this, I got this good thing, and then you're probably going to do it more. Or you're going to associate the behavior with the bad consequence. Oh, that wasn't a good idea. I'm not going to do that thing anymore. And that was the basics of operant conditioning. Now again, Thorndike was the first guy that was working on this, and he came up with this idea that he called the law of effect. And basically it's just what we've been saying. If your behavior gets rewarded, you're very likely to do it again. And that's what he was showing, and he was using these puzzle boxes, and he found that if you rewarded animals, it would take them less and less and less time, all right, to solve these puzzle boxes, particularly if they were getting rewarded. This is where Skinner comes in. So Skinner came in and said, all right, I like what Thorndike's onto here, but I'm going to study it just slightly more sophisticated. Instead of doing these random puzzles that it's hard to kind of measure, I'm going to do something even more sophisticated. And he created what we now call a Skinner box, which is just a box that you can put some sort of animal into. In this case, it's usually a rat or a mouse. Inside the box, there's any number of things, but the three most important ones would be a bar that the animal can push. This is the behavior that you can then measure. How many times will the animal push the bar? There's a computer that's attached to this that measures it. And then there's two ways that the animal can get rewarded, either with some sort of food reward, some kind of treat that they really like. For example, mice really love little sugar pellets, or some sort of water reward. And I'm going to talk about this one later because I did some studies where alcohol was actually the reward. We would give them little drinks of alcohol here. But basically all Skinner was doing was just expanding on what Thorndike was doing and basically deciding and measuring in very clear scientific ways that yes, you could develop and shape behavior by giving rewards or giving punishments. So what do we know about operant conditioning? Well, we know that every day your behaviors are constantly being reinforced and shaped. All right, there's constant reinforcement happening in your life. Reinforcement is just anything that occurs that's likely to strengthen the preceding response. In other words, stuff that's going to make you do a behavior more. You're likely, as one of the reasons you go to work, you're going to keep going to work because somebody's going to be paying you some money. That payment is a reinforcer. It's going to keep you going there. You might go to a student organization lunch, even if you don't really care about the student organization lunch, because they're probably going to feed you pizza. And you might keep going back to that student organization because they're going to bring cookies every time. In other words, you're going to keep doing that behavior because you're getting something that you like, some sort of reinforcement out of it. The other thing that we are constantly doing or having done to us in life is shaping. We don't normally start with the hardest behavior. Normally what we do is do behaviors as we're learning something complex. We do it in small amounts until we get better and better and better and better at the bigger thing. So if you think back to the video we watched in the last lecture with the dog that was learning to sniff out the cancer samples. They didn't just put the dog into a room with a bunch of samples and say, go get the cancer sample. It started off in smaller behaviors. So it probably started off with just look at me as the trainer and I'll give you a treat. Sit down, I'll give you a treat. Sniff this thing, give you a treat. Sniff this thing, give you a treat. Then I show you two. Sniff this one, but not the other one, and I'll give you a treat. Or whatever it is, to where eventually there's a bigger behavior where I can put you in a room with a bunch of samples and you can tell me which one it is that has the cancer in it. That idea is shaping. I remember we do this a lot when I coached little kids basketball before, and we do this when we're teaching them how to dribble the ball. So the first thing we do is just have them hold the ball and bounce it with two hands. Right? That's the first step, and we're giving all sorts of praise as the reinforcement. Good job, great job, you're doing a really good job. Then the next thing we do once they've gotten that behavior down is we say, okay, now we want you to do it with one hand. So we're still standing still, but we're bouncing the ball now with one hand. Once they've got that, and we've given all kinds of praise, we'll move it a little bit harder. So we'll say, now we want you to bounce it with one hand, but we want you to take a couple steps. All right, when you get that down, say, all right, now we want you to jog a little bit. Now we want you to run a little bit. So again, we're increasing the behavior, but constantly giving that reinforcement. So that's the shaping behavior. So I'm going to tell you a little bit more about reinforcement, and then I'll show you an example of shaping. So there's two kinds of reinforcement, and you're going to see this also when we get to a little bit later in the lecture. We're going to talk punishment. But with reinforcement, I want you to remember two things. First of all reinforcement means that the behavior is going to happen more. Reinforcers make the behavior happen more. Right? That's the first thing. The second one is that there's positive and negative reinforcement. Positive reinforcement is just what it sounds like. You get something good, and because you got something good, it's going to make you do the behavior more. So this puppy in the picture is getting a treat for doing this trick. So the puppy is likely to do the trick more because the treat is good. Negative reinforcement takes away something that's bad to hopefully get you to do a behavior more. So think about when you're riding in your car and you don't put your seatbelt on. The behavior that we want you to do is wear your seatbelt more often. That's what the safety officers want you to do. Wear your seatbelt more often. So to get you to do that, if you don't have your seatbelt on, you're going to hear ding, 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 and it's really, really, really annoying. So in order to get that annoying beeping to stop, you're going to put your seatbelt on. So you're still being reinforced. You're more likely to wear your seatbelt because you don't want to hear that really aversive sound. That's negative reinforcement. And then related to shaping, there's two examples here of shaping. One of them is we can actually train not just dogs, but even rats to sniff out landmines. The reason this is really neat and really interesting is just because they're smaller, they don't weigh as much, they can get inside buildings that have been blown up, for example, and get into places where the dogs likely can't get to. But just as you would train a dog, you're going to train a rat the same way. You're going to start with smaller behaviors until you've worked towards a larger behavior. And then slightly more fun, you can actually teach your rats to do some very complex tricks, such as playing basketball. And we're going to watch a quick video to talk about how to train your rat to play basketball. Okay, so all that up to this point has been reinforcers. And remember, I said the number one thing about reinforcers is that they make you do a behavior more. So keep that in your head. Reinforcers do a behavior more. There is another side to operant conditioning. There's also something called punishment. The number one thing about punishment is that it makes a behavior happen less. Usually it's an undesirable behavior that we want you to stop doing, right? So we're going to give a punishment to get that undesirable behavior to stop happening, right? And just like with reinforcers, there's positive and negative. So punishment, behavior happens less. If I give a positive punishment, I'm doing something to you that is bad or that you don't like, something aversive, to get you to stop doing the behavior. So in the case of a parent might spank a child for doing a behavior they don't like to get the child to stop doing that behavior. Don't talk back to me. So I give the child a spanking, hoping that that will get the child to stop talking back to me, to stop doing that bad behavior or the undesirable behavior. That's positive punishment. I'm giving something that the child doesn't like, something not good. So positive meaning I'm introducing something to the situation that's not good. Negative punishment, on the other hand, is taking away something that is good that the child likes until they stop doing the bad behavior. So until you stop talking back to me, I'm going to take away your cell phone, or I'm not going to let you watch TV, or I'm going to take your car keys. Whatever it is that the child likes, I'm taking away the thing that the child likes until the behavior decreases. The behavior of talking back to me decreases. So hopefully positive and negative punishment make sense. All right? I always like to review it this way. And honestly, I actually recreate this chart every single time I take a quiz or I take a test. So for example, when you're going to take your exam for Unit 2, what I would do before you do anything else on Unit 2 exam, flip to a blank page and scribble out this chart. What you want to do is write the word positive at the top, negative at the top, reinforcement, and punishment. And then draw yourself 4 boxes. And what you want to write for reinforcement, because every reinforcement increases the behavior. So you're going to write increases behavior, increases behavior. Every punishment decreases behavior. So you'll write decreases behavior, decreases behavior. Then you're going to go through and say, okay, a positive reinforcer increases behavior. Why? Well, because you get something good. You get something good like money or candy. A negative reinforcer increases behavior. Why? Because you're getting rid of something bad, like the beeping sound, or somebody nagging you, like your mom going, clean your room, clean your room, clean your room. Have you cleaned your room? You really need to clean your room. I said clean your room. Okay, Mom, I will clean my room. Stop bugging me. So I'm going to do the behavior more. I'm going to clean my room more. May not be happy about it, but I'll at least do the behavior more because I'm getting rid of that bad, annoying nagging. All right, so reinforcers. Punishers. You have a positive punisher, it's going to decrease your behavior. Why? Because you're getting something bad. Something bad happens to you, like a spanking or a speeding ticket. Negative punishers decrease behavior because, again, you're getting rid of something good. All right? So I lose my cell phone. I lose my car keys. I might lose my driver's license until I stop drinking and driving, or whatever it is. A negative punishment decreases behavior. So if you had to guess, which one of these do you think is the most powerful for getting a behavior to occur? Well, what we know is that it's actually this diagonal. Positive reinforcement is the best, the strongest way to get somebody to do a behavior. And negative punishment is the strongest way that we know to get someone, right, to decrease a behavior we don't want, taking away something good until they stop that behavior.
All right, so welcome back to the official slides for this particular chapter. Hopefully that was a good review for you for classical conditioning and operant conditioning. I have the links down here for the rat basketball if you're curious about that. So let's move into now some of the types of memory. So the first one I want you to know is the difference between implicit and explicit memory. The big difference here is whether or not you can really sort of describe it to someone. So the easiest way to think about it is implicit memory is sort of your unconscious memory, and explicit memory is conscious memory. So things that you can actively say, describe, tell somebody about, retrieve from your actual memory. Whereas unconscious memory is there and you can do it, but it's really hard to sort of describe it to somebody. And so I think about the easiest way to kind of think of it in my mind is like behaviors almost. So I think about riding a bicycle, right? You can describe some parts of it to a person, right? Like you could say you sit on the seat, you hold the handlebars, you put one foot on each pedal, and you sort of push your feet alternating. One goes down while the other goes up, right? But if you were to describe to somebody, how do you stay balanced on the bicycle? That's a lot harder. So describing balance is a lot harder. And you could say, well, you know, if you start to lean to one direction, you sort of lean back the other direction, and you sort of try to balance back and forth. And again, you don't really have words for that. So it's things like skills that you don't really have the ability to say. That's implicit memories. The conditioning that we were talking about, right? Conditioned responses. You don't always have an explanation for why you're responding to something. So think about that classical conditioning, right? You don't necessarily know why you're having a response all of a sudden, right? Because you don't necessarily know that you have paired two stimuli together, right? But all of a sudden, right, you've been triggered because one of the stimuli has occurred, and all of a sudden you've responded, and you're like, why am I doing this, right? But it has happened. So again, sometimes things will happen, sometimes memories will come up, and it's very clear that you have some kind of knowledge, but you don't necessarily know why. That's more the implicit memory side of things. Versus explicit memories, which are very conscious memories. So this is when you can retrieve an item. This is when I could even ask you a specific piece of information, like, what is your birthday? Most people can retrieve that item from their memory and can tell you, this is my birthday. My birthday is this date, or whatever it is. And they can know that it is the correct item or not. So you could look at a list of choices and you could pick out a correct item. That's the kind of test that most people prefer to take, right? You guys like multiple choice type tests because you can look through the choices and pick out the correct one. Now keep in mind, for the purposes of this class, I'm about to tell you about two more kinds of memory called declarative and procedural memory. And for this class, you can sort of think of them as the same thing. But if you go on and take, for example, 3116, you will learn that there are some slight differences and they're slightly different. But again, for this class, you can think of declarative memories almost like the explicit memories, things that you can say, I know this, I know the details. So declarative memories are things where you can tell me the time, the place, the circumstances of the event, this is what happened, this is what's going on. And these are the ones that could be lost, for example, if somebody has amnesia, and I'll tell you a little bit more about amnesia in a bit. And then the implicit memories are the procedural memories. So again, that's why I was talking about riding a bicycle. That's a procedure of how to balance on a bike. That's a procedure. So it's an ability to recall a movement sequence or how to perform some kind of action. And again, from a practical point of view, there's really not a lot of difference here. But again, if you do move on and you take a more advanced class about cognition, you will learn there are a few slight differences. So again, don't let that fool you if you move on. But for the purposes of our class, we're going to kind of consider them the same thing. So declarative memories are explicit memories. Procedural memories are implicit memories. But even that is not all of the kinds of memories that there are. There are a lot of kinds of memories that are associated with more of the conscious side of yourself. So again, explicit memories or declarative memories, that allows you to, again, to bring up things that are facts, memories that you know about places where you've been, autobiographical information, so information about yourself, things that you've done, things that you know about yourself, various episodic memories, things that you know that you've seen and done, semantic memories, so just facts about things, versus other kinds of what we would consider to be unconscious type memories. So implicit memories are those non-declarative memories, again, procedural memories are considered sort of the same thing. So again, a lot of different kinds of types of memories that you can have. The other thing that we know is that you can process memories in different ways, and you can store memories for different lengths of time. And this is sort of what we're going to build up to. The last thing that we'll end up doing in this particular lecture is we'll talk about how you make long-term memories at the cellular level. That's what we're headed towards, again, with the biology side of things, brain and behavior here. Let's start with some basic ideas here. Short-term memory versus long-term memory. Short-term memory involves more of the frontal lobe being activated. Long-term memory requires more of the brain, specifically the temporal lobe, but there's a lot of other things involved there. There's some kinds of long-term memory that involve, for example, parts of the limbic system. We talked about the hippocampus, for example, that's helping you make certain kinds of long-term memories. Short-term memories are just as they sound. That's why we named them short-term memories. They don't last very long. These are things that you can keep in your mind for just a few minutes, especially if you're distracted. It's going to be even shorter. Again, unless you're working with them. If you're actively working with that memory and thinking about it and doing something, going over it in your head, it'll stay a little bit longer. But unless you convert it into long-term memory, it's going to be gone after a few minutes. Long-term memory, on the other hand, will stay, again, a lot longer. And there's a little bit of debate in the scientific field about whether or not long-term memories really are indefinite. We don't really know for sure. We don't even really know how to test for sure if they are indefinite. But the going idea is that we think they are relatively indefinite, that once you have made a memory, unless there has been some actual damage that has damaged the part of the brain where that memory has been encoded, which is just a fancy word for stored and put into the brain, you should be able to retrieve that memory. You might have to have that memory sort of triggered, right? You might have to have a clue or somebody sort of jog your memory a little bit, but you should still be able to remember it. But that being said, there isn't a single place in the brain where memories are stored, right? There's not like one brain region where, oh, this is the brain region where memories are stored. There isn't some kind of like hard drive or thumb drive or something where it's like, oh, yep, I've got a terabyte of memory in my brain. That doesn't exist, right? Memories are sort of kind of spread out throughout the brain. You'll hear more about that as we move forward. Let's talk a bit more about personal memories. We call these sometimes episodic memories. Sometimes they're called autobiographical memories. But these are memories related to yourself. So things that you remember about yourself. So where were you when such and such happened, right? Most people can remember. If it's a pretty big significant event, you can say, oh, I remember where I was when such and such and such and such happened. Again, you guys are all too young for most of the events that were big when I was growing up. But again, I was alive during the year 2000 when it switched from 1999 to the year 2000. That was a big deal when I was growing up. And again, for a long time, people talked about that, like, oh, here's what I did to celebrate that year and all kinds of stuff. But again, that's a kind of autobiographical memory. People can talk about where they were and what they were doing and how they celebrated that particular night and that sort of thing. Those would be considered episodic memories. There's a really cool story in your textbook about patient KC. And the reason that we do this and we abbreviate it this way is to keep the patient anonymous. That usually means, at least at the time that the textbook is written, that the patient is still alive. When we abbreviate them this way to, again, keep them as anonymous as possible. But patient KC in your book experiences episodic amnesia. Amnesia is just a fancy word for can't recall that particular kind of memory or lacks that kind of memory. And patient KC has a complete inability to recall personally experienced events. So it's as if patient KC hasn't experienced these kinds of things. And doctors have been able to figure out that it's because of some frontal lobe injuries and reduced blood flow to the frontal lobes. So again, it's these weird sorts of injuries like this. If you think about, we talked about another example with Phineas Gage in the frontal lobe. It's when people have these sorts of freak accidents or freak injuries like this that have really been able to shed some light on some of the brain regions and sort of what they're responsible either for processing or helping us to be able to do. And in the case of patient KC, it's allowed them to be able to basically mentally travel through the past. So we don't think, again, that's where you store memories, but that you need your frontal lobes to sort of almost be able to kind of flip through like you would like a scrapbook, right, of things that you have experienced in your life. And that if your frontal lobe isn't working properly, you can't really do that. And so basically you lose your episodic memory. So again, amnesia is defined as just a partial or total loss of memory. It can happen for any number of reasons. Again, it can be because of some injury. It can be because of things like a stroke. It can be because you've had an accident of some kind. I'm going to tell you an example in a little while of some mild amnesia that I experienced this summer following a medical procedure that I had. The anesthesia that they gave me to make me go to sleep during the procedure actually caused some mild amnesia. But people with amnesia typically perform normally on tests of implicit memory. So amnesia tends to be more disruptive to the explicit memories, right? So they tend to forget things that they can explicitly say happened rather than things that implicitly they have learned. And that's a very interesting thing that scientists are also still trying to figure out is why does there seem to be sort of a difference in implicit memory storage and explicit memory storage as far as how amnesia tends to affect one and not the other. So let's kind of take a step back for just a minute. So I told you there isn't one specific brain region that holds the memories, but we didn't always know that. And a guy named Carl Lashy really searched for a long time trying to find out if there was such a thing. Like, was there a brain region where memories were stored? And he searched all over the brain and he tried all kinds of different studies in animals to try to figure out, what if I destroy this brain region? What if I destroy this brain region? Could he get people, the animals, to have their memory be disrupted, right? And basically the end result is no, there didn't really seem to be a thing. And again, that's how we get to where we are today, where we can say there doesn't seem to be one place where memory is stored. And if you think about it, that probably is a really good thing, right? Because you don't want to have it to be where you could have an injury and have every single memory be gone. That doesn't make a lot of sense. It makes sense that memories would be sort of spread out all over the brain. But that being said, what Carl Lashy did find is that the amount of memory disturbance that you're going to have following some kind of injury seems to be related to the size of the injury a lot more than where the actual injury occurred. Now, where the injury occurred is going to be important for other kinds of symptoms that you might have. So for motor problems that you might have or something like that. But as far as memory problems go, it's definitely going to be related to how big the injury was, how much of the brain got damaged. And that's going to be a lot more important than anything else. So there's another patient that I want to tell you about. His name was patient HM pretty much forever, but he has recently passed away. So they have actually finally released his name. His name was Henry. And he suffered from severe debilitating seizures as a young man, to the point where he really couldn't even leave his house to go and do anything. He was having so many seizures so frequently. And nothing seemed to be working. And so his doctors finally, kind of as a last resort, said, well, we sort of figured out where in your brain the seizures are originating. And so we think if we go in and we sort of kind of just destroy that part of the brain, it will at least stop the seizures from being triggered. I mean, are you at least willing to give that a try? And at that point, Henry and his family were just desperate. And they were like, yeah, that's got to be the only thing that's going to work. So doctors went in, they did that. It turns out, again, kind of flash forwarding in the story, that it was mostly just his hippocampus. There was a tiny bit of his amygdala as well, but again, mostly just his hippocampus that they ended up destroying. Again, successful surgery, successful outcome. Patient HM was able to live another, I think, almost like 50 to 60 years following this procedure. The seizures were mostly gone. He was able to live a mostly healthy life. However, because they had taken out basically the functioning of the hippocampus, patient HM had severe problems with explicit memory. Basically, he had severe amnesia. He could no longer make new long-term explicit memories. Again, not implicit, but explicit memories. He still had above IQ. He could perform well on perceptual tests. He could still had perfectly fine short-term memory if he was talking to you in the moment. He still had perfectly functioning implicit memories. But again, because he couldn't make explicit memories, he didn't remember that he had learned certain tasks and certain skills. So again, he didn't know he knew how to do certain things, but if you asked him to actually do the skill, he would do it. And then he'd be really surprised, like, wow, I didn't know I could do that. Like painting was one of them. They taught him how to paint. And he would be really surprised every time he would do it. Like, wow, I didn't know I could paint that well. And they'd be like, yeah, good job. Because again, he couldn't make the explicit memory that he had learned how to paint. He didn't have that ability to make that long-term memory. But again, the implicit skills memory was still there. So again, the hippocampus is very important for making explicit memories, even though the explicit memories aren't stored in the hippocampus, because patient HM could still remember things that had happened before the surgery. He could still remember things that had happened to him as a child. He could remember people in pictures from when he was younger. So again, he still remembered stuff prior, so it didn't destroy all of his long-term memories. It just kept him from making new ones. On the other hand, it is possible to disrupt somebody's implicit memory. The book will talk about another patient called patient JK, who does have problem with disrupted implicit memory. And in their case, they developed something like Parkinson's disease, which damaged their basal ganglia. And this basically caused a problem with performing tasks that they had been able to do their whole life. But again, they could still recall very explicit events, and they could still form new memory about explicit events. And so that sort of led to this debate, and this would actually be a really interesting pack-back question as well. Which would be worse, right? Living a very healthy life like patient HM and being able to do tasks with no problems, just not being able to remember and make any new memories about those tasks. Or being like patient JK and being able to remember everything and being able to form new memories, but then losing the ability to perform tasks. Which do you think would feel worse to you? And again, there's not necessarily a right or wrong answer there. I think that would be an interesting debate for people to have. So a little bit more about amnesia. There's actually two sort of names for amnesia. Amnesia in general is just a loss of memory. but you can have loss of memory before the event or after the event. So again, something that disrupts your memory. It can be, again, be an injury, it can be a trauma, it can be a stroke, or in the case that I'm going to tell you about, a medical procedure that I had this summer. So at the very beginning of the summer, right after we let out for the spring semester, I had some nasal sinus surgery. They completely redid. They had to break my nasal septum and put it back straight. And then they had to completely redo one of my sinuses and a little bit of work on the other side. Because what was happening is that I kept getting these recurrent chronic sinus infections. And then because things were so sort of out of balance, it kept kind of backing up into my middle ear, and it was causing a lot of ear infections. And let me tell you, very painful surgery, horrific, but long-term result is I'm feeling better, and I just recovered from a cold, and the first time in my life I've ever gotten a cold and didn't get a sinus and ear infection. So yay, it worked, and it seemed to be worth it. But I digress. What I'm going to tell you about, though, is the actual day of the surgery. So I go into the surgery center, and I took my mom with me because you have to take a person with you to sort of help you, like, basically after the surgery. And I go into my assigned room, met with the doctor, met with the anesthesiologist, met with the nurse, got everything all in order, and then it was time to start. And so what they had me do is they had me get undressed and put on the little, surgical gown thing and get into the bed. And then when I was done with that, the nurse came in and gave me an IV, and that's the last thing I actually remember. So again, I remember meeting with the doctor, I remember meeting with the anesthesiologist and the nurse, I remember getting undressed and put on the gown, and I remember getting in the bed and getting an IV. Apparently, and again, I don't remember any of this, I at some point had to use the bathroom, so I got up, had to get help, but I got up and we wheeled the little cart thing that was holding the fluid bag down the hall, and I used the restroom, and I came back, and I got back into the bed. And then the doctor and nurses or whoever it was came to get me, and they wheeled me in my little bed into the surgery center. At some point, they put me to sleep for the surgery, did the surgery. They woke me up after the surgery and took me into this recovery area where apparently I had an entire conversation with my nurse that, again, don't remember, about being in pain. And then after that, they took me back to the original room where I had started, where my mother was waiting for me, where again, apparently I had a conversation about like everything hurting, and they gave me more pain medicine. And then at some point, I remember waking up in that room. Again, I had not remembered being awake prior to that. I thought I woke up in the room with my mom. Did not remember being awake, did not remember talking to anybody, definitely didn't remember asking for pain medicine, none of that. So again, I had actually a little bit of both of these kinds of amnesia. So again, the surgery and whatever drugs they gave me would be, again, not exactly an injury, what would be the thing that caused the amnesia. And in my case, I had a little bit of retrograde amnesia. I didn't remember a few things that happened before the surgery. Like again, I didn't remember getting up and going to the bathroom. I didn't remember being wheeled down to surgery. So again, a little bit of retrograde amnesia. And then also a little bit of anterograde amnesia, where I didn't remember some of the stuff that happened after the surgery either. Didn't remember talking to the nurse about being in pain. Didn't remember being in the recovery room. Didn't remember being taken back to the little waiting room where my mom was. Didn't remember talking to that person about pain. So again, I missed a little bit of my day. But again, that's totally normal, and it happens a lot following surgery. But again, that's the idea of amnesia. So you can imagine what would happen if there had actually been actual physical damage or even bleeding in the brain or something like that. So that's the idea of retrograde amnesia and anterograde amnesia. So retrograde is when you miss something that happened prior, you forget something that you already had. So I think of like retro as like old stuff, like it's retro. So you forget stuff you already learned. And then anterograde is you messed up a new memory. You couldn't make anything new, and anything starts with an A. So you couldn't make any kind of new memory. Again, I eventually was able to make new memories, but that's just how I remember it. Another interesting thing that we know is you can also make emotional memories. And we've been talking about that multiple times this semester. And we know that the amygdala is involved. We talked about that a lot. But if you think about it, if your amygdala gets damaged, you're not going to be able to make emotional memories. And we also talked about how important that is, that you need to be able to make emotional memories in order to effectively judge what's happening in the world around you. Right? And we talked about last time with the frontal lobe basically not paying attention to the information that the amygdala was sending. Right? Well, if the amygdala is not sending any information, the frontal lobe is still not going to be able to do its job of making correct decisions. So again, we know that the amygdala is important for emotional memory, and it has to send that information to the frontal lobe. So the last part of what we're going to do in this particular lecture is talk about the actual biological things that happen in the brain when we are learning and remembering. So what exactly happens at the cellular level when we learn and remember? What does that actually look like? What does a memory look like in our cells, in our neurons? What does that actually look like? So let's talk about something that I mentioned at the very beginning of this lecture. I said that our brain was plastic. And again, I didn't mean plastic like the substance. I just meant that it's changeable. And again, what I meant was that every time your neurons communicate with each other, so every time one neuron has an action potential and releases neurotransmitters, and another neuron catches those neurotransmitters and then makes its own action potential, those neurons change. Right, to be able to communicate with each other better in case they need to send that message again. So at the neural level, memory is basically just changes that happen at a synapse so that the two neurons that are involved at a synapse, basically the sending neuron and the receiving neuron, are able to do that better. Right? So to find the neural correlates of memory, you basically just need to sort of look at what's happening in the brain, right, during a memory formation at the synaptic level. So basically you need to look at the presynaptic side and the postsynaptic side and kind of see what exactly is happening. And again, I'm going to flash forward in the story because we've already done that. We've looked at it and we've decided and we've called it something called long-term potentiation. Right? So basically what that means is that two cells that have already communicated, so an axon ending, right, and the dendrite of another cell with a synapse in between, if they have already communicated with each other before, right, they basically try to get better at communicating in the future. And we call that process long-term potentiation. Long-term meaning they try to stay good at communicating for a long time. We're not creative, we call that long-term. And then potentiated just means they have the potential to communicate better, right? So this is in response to stimulation, again, at a synapse. It's a changed amplitude of excitatory postsynaptic potential that lasts for hours to days or longer. It plays a part in associative learning. So basically, when you learn to associate things, you get neuronal connections, you get neurons communicating with each other. And this is why it's really important when you're trying to learn that you try to connect what you're learning with things that you already know in your brain. This is why I'm always trying to give you examples of things that you already might know or things that you already might think of, because what happens when you do that is that you can connect it with cells that are already in there, and the long-term potentiation happens faster and the memory sticks in there better. Right? Now I'm going to give you another example of what I want you to do when you think about long-term potentiation. And again, this is just a weird Dr. West quirk of how my brain works. But this is how I think of long-term potentiation. So again, you've got a synapse, you've got the axon ending that's going to send a message, and you've got the dendrite that's going to receive the message. And again, remember that message that we're going to send across is a neurotransmitter. Okay. So the action potential comes down, the axon ending is going to be stimulated and it's going to release the neurotransmitter into the synapse. The dendrite's going to catch the neurotransmitter, that activates it. So it's either going to let in some kind of ion that's going to charge it up with an EPSP, and then it's going to eventually produce its own action potential. Here's how I like to think about it. I like to think about it as two people that have gone on a first date and they've met using some kind of dating app. All right. So these two people, the axon ending and the dendrite, are two people that have gone on a date and they met using a dating app. So they went out on a date, they met on a dating app, and they communicated on this first date, and it went good. Right? So the date went well, which means, yay, date went well, we had a good time. Well, what do people do if they had a good time on a first date? And be PG here, right? What they're going to do, if they're being PG, right, is they are going to share more contact information with each other. See, that's not where you thought I was going with that, because you weren't being PG. All right, so now instead of just talking on the dating app, now maybe they'll share their cell phone numbers with each other. Maybe they'll share their social media, like their Instagram account with each other or something like that. So now when they want to get in touch with each other, it's a lot easier because they have more than one way to get in touch with each other. That's what long-term potentiation is. So now the next time they want to go on a date, it's a lot easier to get in touch with each other, right? Because the axon ending has a lot more ways to send out messages, can blast out a whole bunch of messages, and then the dendrite can catch any one of the messages, either on social media or their cell phone or the dating app, and can see, oh yeah, cool, they're asking me out on another date. Yeah, I want to go on another date. And then the communication happens faster. That's what long-term potentiation is, at least in the way my brain works. So again, it's a strong burst of electrical stimulation that's applied here. Basically what it does is it causes a release here. Then this connection gets stronger. So the next time it's released, right, the same amount of energy is released, you get a stronger response. So the first time, yeah, you had a successful date, you exchanged information, so that now the next time you want to go on a date, it's a lot easier for that date to go well, for you to get communicating with each other because you have a better connection with each other. I'm going to show it to you in a couple more ways. So for long-term potentiation to happen, the EPSP is going to increase in size, meaning the dendrite is going to be able to have a bigger EPSP. It's going to be able to catch more message. Why? Because more neurotransmitter was released. Remember, the axon ending was given more ways to communicate. So now they don't just have to communicate through the dating app. They can also use social media. They can also use text. They can also call. They can also use Snapchat, whatever it is. They can send out a whole bunch of messages. And the dendrite can also catch all those messages. They've got more receptors that they put out. So the postsynaptic membrane, that's the dendrite, is actually going to put out more receptors. Or both can happen. And when both happens, you can imagine it's going to be a lot more successful to have a second date or a third date or a fourth date, because they're always going to be able to get in touch with each other when they need to get in touch with each other. Right? And that's how you modify these existing circuits. Right? The dendrites put out more connections. Right? They actually can even make more of themselves. They kind of expand themselves out. Right? They can put out more receptors. The axon ending can release more neurotransmitter. Right? So let's kind of look at what that sort of looks like. And I'm going to show it to you in two ways. The first one is sort of in cartoon form. So here's the first time they go on a date, right? A little bit of neurotransmitter is released. This is that dating app. They just have one way to really get in touch with each other. And there's a couple receptors. The date went well, though, so they were able to produce an action potential. Yay, great. So they decided they're going to share more information with each other. So they're going to share cell phone numbers. They're going to share social media accounts. They're going to share all that kind of stuff with each other. So as you can see, the next time they want to communicate, look, a lot more receptors, right? And a lot more neurotransmitter got dumped out. So the next time they want to communicate, it's a lot easier, right, to have an action potential occur. Right? This is long-term potentiation. In other words, what this means is that the next time this pathway is stimulated, next time this action potential comes down, it's going to basically make the next action potential happen a lot faster and a lot easier. This means this memory, right, which basically means that this neuron is communicating with this neuron, is going to communicate with the next neuron, is going to communicate with the next neuron, which ultimately is going to make you eventually consciously remember whatever it is you were trying to remember, is going to happen a lot faster and a lot easier. But think about what I just told you. Right? What I just told you is that this neuron is going to have to make more neurotransmitter. And this neuron is going to have to make and put out more receptors. That's going to take a while. So when you're studying, you don't want to cram the night before the exam, Because even if you do, and even if you try to remember, you haven't seriously even given your biology enough time to make neurotransmitter and to put out more receptors. That takes some time. So it's a lot more effective if you study for a little bit, one night and then the next night and then the next night, because it gives your body and your biology time to actually make this happen, which is going to make the memory happen a lot faster and a lot more able to be retrieved. And if you've already got this happening in your brain, where you've got a memory that's really strong in your brain, like let's say you've already had surgery before, right? And that's something you already remember in your life. And now you can go back to that story I was telling you about, right? With anterograde and retrograde amnesia. Connect this with your own story. Why? Because this part's already done. And all you're going to do is add a piece to it. So some of the work is already there. Some of the neuron connections have already got LTP going on, that long-term potentiation going on. And all you're going to do is add another connection going on. So again, connecting things that you want to learn with things that you already know, that's that association learning that we started this whole lecture with, is a really fast and quick way to learn things. And that's why it works so effectively, is because you're taking advantage of the fact that some neurons have already connected with each other. All right, one final picture, and then I promise I'll stop talking. All right, another way of looking at this, and this was done, scientists sort of scanned in on some pictures of neurons. And again, if you really look at it through a microscope, it's just going to look like a bunch of little black blobs. But then what they did is they hired some graphic artists to come in and sort of recreate what this might actually look like if we really could zoom in enough, as opposed to just cartoon form. And so this would be an axon ending, spilling out a little bit of neurotransmitter onto a dendrite. And this is what it might look like after it has been potentiated long-term, or long-term potentiation has occurred. So you can see a lot more neurotransmitter. The artist didn't do quite as good of a job here about showing the receptors, although I think that's what these little lines are supposed to represent, that there's more neurotransmitter that's more receptor for the neurotransmitter that's happening in there. But again, the idea here is that the dendrites actually change, right? More neurotransmitter gets dumped out, but the change actually occurs in the dendrite. Your brain is constantly changing and molding and changing itself as you learn new things, so that it helps you to continue remembering those new things. All right, I'll talk to you soon. Let me know if you have any questions.